Beginning on your monster project in Photoshop, we are going to create a new document. That new document that you create, I want it to be set at 8 inches by 10 inches, 300 pixels per inch resolution. So when you look at it, width of 8 inches, height of 10 inches, resolution 300. It's important to create a project file. This project document that you are going to be working on, it's important to have that so then when you bring all of your assets in, you are then resizing them to that document. Because if we don't do that, we end up having issues of accidentally building our project at the wrong size. So I have created my base document that I am going to be working with this session. I'm going to save it, so it's now saved. And the next thing that I need to do is figure out how to bring my assets into this document. Saving this into my folder that I have on the desktop. So I have a series of images that I will be using with this project as I'm working to creating my own variant of the creature from the Black Lagoon, going with our classic movie monster. So I grabbed some different fish eyes and scales and fins and a fish mouth, and all of these then will be extracted and manipulated to add to this empty file that I currently have here. So with that, we have a couple of different ways that we can bring those assets in. Now, one thing I want to point out is all of the files, from my Photoshop file to all of my assets, are in a single folder, and that is really, 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 really important, because when we are doing non-destructive editing, we are now linking to these assets. We are not going to be embedding them permanently into our file, but instead they are linked to it. So if we don't keep track of these asset files, the connections will be broken and our project will fail. So put all of your assets in one folder. We have our PSD in one folder, and now we can add these assets to it. Now, a common way that people add files one into another is they drag from the desktop into our window. And then when I do that, it inserts that onto my document. If I want to scale this up, I hold down Shift to make it a little bit bigger so it starts to fill my document, move it down. Decide that's good. Now I can click on the check mark and accept that. And now when I do this, we will see that by putting the picture in this manner, it actually put it in as a smart object. So when it's a smart object, that means I now have a connection back to the original object. It also means I have the opportunity to do a bunch of things in a non-destructive manner, so I can undo them down the road if I need to, which is a very useful activity. Another way that we can bring in our files is we can now place that object in. So if I want to go grab some fish eyes, you can see that that's plenty big. I'll shrink it down later. And we can now see it's put in the fish eyes. And we can see it's again turning it into a smart object. Covers a method of using Bridge, Adobe Bridge, which is a file browser on steroids, as a way to open these assets. Now, one thing that it does to allow all of the objects to be smart objects when they get opened is it's pre-converted all of the items to Photoshop files instead of JPEGs. So right now all of my downloaded pictures that I'm using are JPEGs. But if I select these files under the In Bridge, under the Tool pull-down menu, I can go to Photoshop, and I will see there's an option of load files into Photoshop layers, which is a really convenient way of dumping a whole bunch of assets in at once. When I do this, okay, it says Photoshop's busy, but it's not. Now it's processing, and we can see where it now put all of those images into my document. Now if I go to my document, I will see that my document is no longer 8 by 10, the original monster file, because it's scaled up my document to match the largest asset I wanted to bring in, which happened to be the picture of me, which was 4,000 by 6,000 pixels in size. So this method of bringing those assets in, we have to then be aware of, well, how big is my document? And then we'll have to move things around and resize accordingly. So is it faster to bring this in as a group and then change my document settings, or to bring things in one at a time? It's going to depend on your situation. So if I look at this, I also notice none of these are smart objects either. They're just pixels. So if I make changes, those are permanent pixel modifications or deletions. And that defeats our purpose of trying to work in a non-destructive manner. So this could be a way to work, and as you can see, that's going to be a great mouth to put on with those other fish eyes, and then got the scales, so it's going to be no end of fun this morning as all of these parts come together, as we come to some version of the creature from the Black Lagoon. We can use bridge or not. We can do it manually or not. A lot of it is going to depend on the workflows that you start to grow accustomed to and comfortable with. It's not a right or wrong. It's not black or white. You need to figure out what works. What's good is to know that there are multiple options. There are different ways to bring everything together. So I am going to close this and not save it. Open up my original file. This is the file that I started with, which is 8 by 10 at 300 pixels per inch, and now I am going to bring my assets into it. I can drag them in, or I can choose place embedded. And we can do one at a time. So if I want to place in the mouth, that's good. It's now linked as a smart object. And I will repeat that process. So if this is too slow a method for you to bring things in, you can always resort to even just dragging it in.
Couldn't you just shift click for place embedded?
And scale up, pull down. All right, so all of my assets are in, all of my assets are set as smart objects. Now what's nice about working on a smart object, if I double click on a smart object, not a normal layer, but a smart object, it says, hey, after editing the contents, save to commit those changes, and then that will be reflected in it. So if I do that, we'll notice it opened up a copy of that. And just to show how powerful this can be, so if I have this image, and if I apply a filter, we'll look at it in more detail in a moment, but if I use something like Liquify, which is one of those just amazing tools, and we'll be doing quite a bit with Liquify in a moment. But if I make some changes with what we're doing, And now say, okay, there I go. I'm happy with that. And we can see, okay, it looks like there's been a change. But if I double click to modify the original, we can see the original is still there and untouched. And if I were to take in this original and do something destructive, just for the sake of so we can see what's going on, if I add that in and hit save, now go back, we'll see that that change is part of it. And that's really where the power is in working with smart objects, is that a smart object, we can do things to how it appears in our composite file without affecting the original. But if we change the original, it changes it in our composite or layered file. So if I undo that and resave it, now go back to the other file, we can see that that is still there. Now if I don't want this disturbing filter on there, we can get rid of it. I can delete it. Delete that filter, so now we're back to normal. What I want to start doing is I want to start cutting things out so that I can put my monster into a new environment on its own background. So the next operation that I'm going to perform is to use our extraction methods, but not to do a permanent extraction, but instead to use layer mask. So if I use quick select to start selecting things, and we can see it's grabbing a little too much, so I'll push back. I'll push back to reclaim. I don't really care about the hair, so if it gets it, it does. If it doesn't, it doesn't really matter. Reclaim a little bit of the arm. I think I'll keep the sleeves as part of what we're doing here. Now, once I reclaim everything and have it set about how I want with this, I'm going to add a layer mask in. Now we can see that the layer mask is opposite of what we want, but the properties of that layer mask, remember that if we go into its properties, we can invert it so that it now cuts out just that character. Now it's a little bit sloppy. I lost a finger along the way, a little sloppy around the neck and shoulder. And I could redo it, which would probably be the faster method, is just to quickly redo the cutting. But remembering that this is a mask, we can, using our paintbrush tool, we can paint on that mask and start to bring things back. The good part is having perfect edges is not really that critical for today's activity, because we are replacing a lot of parts with other items. With my layers reasonably cut out so that I have some sources and pieces to work with, I have a fish mouth, I have a fin, I have another fin. I don't know if those are really going to work. I have some scales that I'll be putting on in a little bit. I have fish eyes twice because I've decided I don't want the center parts, and I'm going to be using each one individually. So to that end, I can work on adding to the mask on this layer, and realizing that the black hides it. If I use black as my color, so I hit X to flip-flop my foreground background color, so now I have black. I can use a big brush, so this fish eye will be my left eye. And this is one of those instances where when I'm working with my brush, having some hardness is going to be useful there, but I may not want a lot of hardness at the part where I'm really trying to blend it. So modifying that hardness, that gives me one eye. Now I can move over to the other eye and go to its mask and so that I can better understand which one is which. If I name my layers, that's going to be beneficial. So I have my left eye, I have my right eye. Now if I go back to the mask on my right eye, get rid of parts that are there. But the good part is, because this is, wrong. Because this is going to be done through a layer mask, I have tremendous flexibility. I can add back in. I'll soften up and blend that edge so that when I stick it over the top of my body and put it onto my head, that I have something to work with. Now, going to my original picture here, this is where I want to do some work to it before I start adding in these additional body parts. You will notice that this picture is on top, so I will need to reorder my layers when the time comes. This layer is a smart object. All of my imported layers or embedded layers are smart objects. We can see by the little icon in their bottom corner. This little icon, when I put my cursor over it, it will tell me that this is a smart object thumbnail, not a normal object. Now, if I decide I do not want to use a smart object, or I want to make something no longer a smart object, if we right-click on the layer, we have an option to rasterize that layer. When we rasterize it, it removes it from being a smart object, and it just makes it a normal dumb object. We could also edit the contents. That will bring us back to the file. And if we run into problems where we don't manage our files properly, so then it tells us that we're missing files, we can relink to the original file. Again, all of that is by right-clicking on a given layer. But what I want to do now is I want to apply a filter. Now, the filter I'm going to apply is Liquify, which is a destructive filter unless we're doing it to a smart object. And when it's a smart object, it allows us to use a smart filter. And smart filters are non-destructive filters, which are really cool because we can go back and keep readjusting them. So I'm going to choose Liquify. And when I choose Liquify, it shows me my original image as I am looking at it. Now with this image, we have different options under Liquify. The default that will come up is the brush tool. And the brush tool, it's a brush, so I can use my square brackets to go bigger or smaller. It effectively allows me to push and pull on my image as if it is silly putty. So I can do whatever I want to my image. So if we decided that this is what I wanted to have happen, and I won't, but if I did and say OK, we'll go here and we'll see OK, there it is. Now we will see that we're having, when we're doing some of this going smaller than the original mask, we're having some issues occurring with that. But I can go back into Liquify, and this is where smart filters are awesome, because normal Liquify, you go back into it and you're like, oh, it's back to how it's been liquefied, and you can't undo. Once you commit, you're committed to it. So now if I restore all, I can bring it back to how it was. Two common ones that we end up using are bloat, and I'm just doing a lot of little clicks to progressively start building up my artwork. Filters are going to give us a lot of options. If I go into a blur filter, want to apply a blur, we can apply a blur. And again, they show up as smart filters, not normal filters, meaning I can double click and go back in and adjust it. Now to compare this and to see how this works, if my artwork is not a smart object, so that if my artwork, let me get rid of these smart filters. If my artwork was a normal layer, and if I do a blur, it's been blurred. And now, if I go in and liquify, oh, well, that's not working really well. It's okay. But I don't have an option to go back in and say, oh, I want to change the blur. Oh, I want to change the liquify. I can't do that when I'm using filters as normal filters. When we use smart filters, they're just like using adjustment layers where we can make adjustments to our image instead of using image adjust, which are destructive adjustments versus non-destructive adjustments. But if I realize that I have really hosed things up and I've made a mess and it's not good, Photoshop has multiple levels of undo. If I hit undo one time, we can undo, edit, undo, and that's Command Z. And we can step backward through the things that we've done. But even better, we have a history palette. In our history palette, we can see all of the different things that I've been working on. So when I've played with the brush, I've done my filters, liquify, rasterizing. So if I go back in time, you'll see that we can very easily undo a bunch of different things. Now if I do something else, so now if I take this layer and pull it down, all of those other things that were at the bottom have now disappeared. So I'm now on a new timeline. Now we can see there's my eyeballs. Undo that. Now I switched to the select tool and I went to grab the eyeball, but it didn't select it because the tool options did not have auto select chosen. Now I generally always leave auto select on and I have it tied to the layer. We can also have our transform controls active so that when I click on a layer it gives me the options for that layer so I can immediately transform it without having to hit Command T. Now if I drag this up, drag that up, we can see, all right, getting some eyeballs here. If I work at it, I think I could turn myself into Commander Akbar from Star Wars with these particular fish eyes, which could be kind of fun. But they're too big, so I do need to scale them down. So if I want to scale one of these down, I can scale it down. Now this is an opportunity to potentially not be doing symmetrical scaling, so I probably won't be holding shift through a lot of this. But I'm stretching it out a little bit so it's a little bigger and rounder, putting it at the side of the head, and then I can commit to that transform. Now I can go over to the other eye and repeat the process. So it's about the same size. When you've been holding modifier keys to scale something, make sure you let go of the mouse before you let go of the modifier key, otherwise you get that odd snapback. So I can start to fit the eyeballs onto the head. Now as these are going onto the head, now I need to go back into it and do some modifications to start cleaning up the edges. This is where we can zoom in. Oh, and I'll commit to that change because I'm happy with it. And now that I've committed to that change, now I can go in with my paintbrush and work on painting on that mask with a much smaller brush now. Trying to make sure that's been cleaned up. Move on to the left eye. and I accidentally clicked on the artwork layer, so then when I went to paint with the brush, I rasterized it by accident, and I didn't mean to convert it, because if I click here and paint with the brush, it says the smart object must be rasterized, so it's then no longer a smart object. I'm like, wait, no. I clicked OK when I should have clicked cancel. Now it's still a smart object. Click on the mask. I can go back and start painting that in. So now we have some eyeballs here. I need a mouth to bring up. Now the mouth is a little bit big again, so can scale down the mouth till it starts to fit. Into my image. Alright, so in position, you can do a little bit of cleanup on it. But as we start working with this, we can start aligning our layers. I see I want to adjust on one of the eyes, do a little bit of painting on the mask. I want to, I think keeping the human nose with the fish eyes and the fish mouth is just adding to sufficient creep factor on there, and then that's working pretty nicely. One more thing is that as you have started to, when you think that the masking is decent on your item that you're working with, so if I decide that this mouth, that is the mask that I want for now, if I go into this mask and do a Liquify, it's a smart object, so when I do my Liquify, we see that we have the whole picture. So if I were to grow this outside of its bounds, if I go back to my picture, we'll notice that we're still bound by the original mask, not the newer mask that we are looking at. So there's some trade-offs that we have to make. At some point, we may decide that we want to trim this artwork and clean up its edges. So if you follow along with the Frankenstein example that's in the textbook, all of the assets that are being placed already have been cropped. They're not just masked, but they have their edges cropped. And we can do that by deleting the layer mask. Oh, undo that. You can take the layer mask. If we break its chain and throw it away, normally it says, hey, do you wish to apply that before you throw it away? Working with a non-smart object layer, if you want to get rid of the layer mask and apply it but no longer have it as a separate mask, you can choose apply layer mask, and now it applies that cropping to that layer. We do not have that same option on a smart layer here. So when we look at that, it's no longer giving us that option. So if we wish to apply a mask permanently, because this is a smart object, we need to rasterize it first. So we choose the rasterize our object, and then when we do that, we do have an option to take our layer and apply that layer mask, and that gets rid of it. Now if we want to continue using smart filters on this layer, then we can convert this layer to a smart object. So we're kind of now, we had a smart object, we rasterized it, applied the mask, and then converted it back to a smart object again. And now that it's a smart object again, now if I apply Liquify to this, if I make it bigger, now I could use the pucker tool and I could now shrink in that little, so that now shrinks down that little corner right there. It's not deleting it, it's just modifying its shape. If I want to pucker out the overall mouth, making it bigger, I can stretch it down. And this is where Liquify is really useful, is we're just pushing and pulling the pixels, and Photoshop is going to attempt to interpolate the difference between them. Now say OK. And now we have our new artwork adhering to what we had. And if I zoom in, I will see that I have maintained all of the original pixel data that was in my image, disturbing as it is. This is a smart object, and I don't like what I've done. I'm going to get rid of it and go back to the original. I do want to pull that corner in, I think. Maybe we'll decide as it progresses further. Working with my fish scales. And as you're going to try and put some textures into your own monster images, there's going to be different ways that you'll go about doing it, and there is no one method. There's just going to be a variety of things that we can use to try and pull this off. And one of the things that I'm going to do with my fish scales here is I'm going to use them in pieces. So I set it to multiply so I can better see what patterns I think are going to give me what I want. I want to use, I think, a larger scale pattern on the neck, and then I'm going to use a different section when I put it on to the cheeks, nose, and forehead. So as I look at the neck, I think I'm going to grab a section out of the layer up there. Now, to do this, what's probably going to be the easiest is to cheat with the clone stamp to put some of these scales onto their own layer. Now I could make a selection, I could copy it, I could paste it onto its own layer so it's just part of this giant scale image, and then I could mask out the edges and work with it. But I can also just work on starting to paint with the actual scales, so I can actually set them as a painting target. But to do that, I need to have them not on top. So I want to grab some of the scales from over here. So I will pull this layer down so it's behind. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is to add a new layer that I will be painting onto. I call this scales. Now, for this painting, if I use the clone stamp tool, now the clone stamp tool allows me to, I can sample from any layer. Now, if I click with the clone stamp, it comes up and says, can't use it because my area to clone has not been defined. Click to define a source point. All right. So, or option click. So I hold down option and I'm going to click in this area because I want to clone this section here. I'm going to put it in on the neck. So I'm looking at some lighting because I view that kind of fits with the neck geometry that I have here. I'm going to line that up with it. So I hold down option, click. Now if I move over here and start painting, you'll see that it's actually taking that scale pattern and putting it on the neck. If I make my brush bigger, it'll happen a little bit faster. But you'll see how it's now painting the scale pattern onto the neck. Now, I might put the mouth layer on top of it so that the mouth layer shows, but looking at how I'm doing the painting, I think I want the scales to be a little bit smaller. So I'm going to just paint out a larger section and then we'll go back and clean it up with a mask. And I'm just going to grab a little bit more scale. Once we have that, Command T will bring up my transform. I can start to shrink it down to get more of the pattern of what I'm looking for. And I think that's getting a lot closer, and now I can go back and clean up that edge. Really will be easiest to clean up the edge using a layer mask. Oh. And I need to switch back to my paintbrush. So we can bring back the mouth, the chin that was there. A little too far on that bottom edge. So now I've fit in some of the scales. Now I can go back and work on cleaning up the edge at the shirt and other things, but if I turn off the large scales, you'll see how it is starting to add to my aquatic appearance. I think I'm going to, because I want to shrink the scales down more for the other part, I want to find something with a little bit smaller scales that we're working with. And most of these are a lot bigger. So if I just, knowing that I need them a lot smaller to work with, I can just shrink this down a lot more, because I want to be able to paint some finer scales into the face. And now this is starting to look like I will have some textures that I'll be able to work with. And this is really the nice part about working with images, is we can now set it up, going back into the clone stamp. I want to paint onto the forehead area. I'm going to find something that will have a curvature following a little bit of what I see with the forehead, a little bit of glow. I think I'm going to grab these scales as my starting point and start to put them on. Now we'll notice that the color is off, but that's okay, because we will be adding in some other color. And then some other scales, some finer scales to go down the nose, into the cheek. And now I'm going to take this layer and shrink it down some more so I can use it as a finer scales for the nose and cheek. Go back to my clone stamp, and I can go grab some scales and fit them in. And I have to do a fair amount of option clicking to keep redefining source points so I can get those scales that I want to paint with. So option click on the scales, and then I can start to paint into the image. I want to come down the ridge of the nose with a straight line of scales, a little bit of glow on it. So I'll grab that. You can see how it now adds to that shape. Ended up with a I caught a spot between fish right there. I'll just put a few extra scales over the top. Now the brush, again, it doesn't have hardness to it. And because these scales do have edges to them, adding a little more hardness in, I think, is going to give me a little better control as I try to get those scales to line up. So I'm effectively using a scale as my paintbrush. So I'm now painting in scales and trying to grab different collections of scales to start building up a little bit of the structures that I want to define on my fish face. So we're getting close here on getting my different scale patterns to take shape. And now if I go back in with my brush, soften the edge a little bit of some of these, mask it out. Can start to blend in a little bit of the edges as I work with that mask. And that gives me the scale patterns that I need to work with. And the next thing will be to work on recoloring those patterns. And coloring to get something like that, add an empty layer, grab a paintbrush, and now I'm painting. Now I can paint with a completely opaque brush, because if I take this layer when I'm done, I can then change its coloring based on layer blending mode, so I can blend this layer in. I don't have to do it that way, but I certainly can. Now if we take this layer and multiply it in, we can see how it goes really dark. With this particular orange, that works reasonably well. I could also burn the color in. That adds a little stronger tone to it. If I pull the opacity of that layer down, it starts to bring out a little bit of the shine, and I think that adds a nice, on the other scales, it's getting the same shine that we see on the eyeballs, which is kind of nice. Now it's showing me that when I look at this, I want to pull a little bit more around on the shirt collar area. So it's what we've looked at in the past, using our layer blending modes. We can start to pull it all together. Now, if I miss some areas or want to pull it back a little bit, let's say I go in too far or decide that I'm not quite sure I like how something is appearing, we can still add a layer mask to this layer, and then we can paint on that layer mask, pulling things back out. Or using a softer brush, I soften my brush, I change the opacity on my brush. While I'm working, I can now type in different numbers on the keyboard, 0 being 100% opaque. And now if I type 5, my brush opacity is 50%. If I type 4, it's at 40%. So that means I'm effectively painting with gray, which allows me to feather that as I work. So I don't have to click up here and say, oh, I want my brush to be at a different thing, or choose gray as a color. I can just very easily start modifying the opacity of that brush while I'm working. If I want something like 47, I type in 47 quickly. If I just hit 4, it's 40. Just hit 7, it's 70. And this works with the paintbrush whenever you are working. It's not something that you have to, it's not just tied to masking, but any type of painting operation while I am working. So if I use the paintbrush on this layer, right now I'm at 20, so we can see it's transparent. If I hit 5, it's at 50, and now where we've gone over it twice, that's opaque. 0 gives me 100, and now we can see, now there's at 100. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It gets it close to being opaque, back to 0. So when you are working with the paintbrush, using the numbers on your keyboard allow you to very quickly modify the opacity or strength of the brush that you're working with. And when we start doing digital painting next session, this will be something that you'll be doing quite frequently, is modifying the strength of your brush just by using the numbers on the keyboard. It's much faster to do it that way than it is to keep clicking up on things up at the top of the screen. So we want to avoid doing that as much as possible so that we have a little more latitude while we are working on our projects. So now I can go back and just soften up a little bit of the mask. With a mask, I can use that to soften up and do a little bit of blending of edges a little bit more as I try to pull all of this together. Now looking at this, I kind of feel that I want to add in another layer that I'll be doing some blending with, and this time I will want to go a little bit darker with it. I want to, in some of my dark areas, now I see that I'm using blue, and you may be thinking, it's like, well, why would you want to go darker with the blue like that? But what I want to do is change my blend mode into multiply so that it starts blending that in a little bit more. So I can start building up some of the shadow areas within my image. So I'm using an additional layer to add in extra shading to start to tie some of the lighting together in my image. Now, I'm a little sloppy with it right now, but that's okay because I'm going to only be doing this just a little bit. So I painted strongly at 100% under multiply. Pull it down to 20%, and suddenly you start to get a before, after, and I can see how that starts to help with the overall lighting in my image to give it a more complete appearance.